All right, so let's just go through these things quickly, and I've got a lot of them, so I'm going to spend some time just kind of breezing over the stuff. If you have, at any point in time, questions about what's going on in your paper, what comments mean, and all that kind of stuff, but come see me, right? I mean, let's sit down and talk about it. Don't just sit there and pretend it's going to go away, right? I mean, if you've got these kind of problems, you need to fix them. What I'm expecting for paper number 2, right, is a much more controlled argument, simply by virtue of the fact that you are dealing with something now that has more limited evidence, right? So instead of dealing with this philosophical issue, now we're dealing with, you know, whether we have various, whether we meet the criteria that we're setting for our operational definition. So the document is going to be better controlled already. What I need to see, though, is control of all these other things, right? If you were dealing with diction issues, just to give you a heads up, if you see the red highlights in your paper, those are major grammar issues. If you see blue highlights in your paper, that means those secondary grammar issues. If you see yellow, those are diction issues, right? If you see green, that's word choice. In other words, you need to get the wrong word in there, and that's something we're going to talk about today, is diction and word choice, all right? Because that's in our that's in one of the chapters that I'm hoping to address today. All right, so let's try to get through this as quickly as possible so that we don't waste too much time. I want to ask about, I want to give you opportunities to ask about your papers. I want to talk to you a little bit about how to organize those papers too. But some of the things that I see happening here, you know, that what I found to be problematic was that many of you wrote without thinking about the obvious counter arguments to your positions. In other words, you kind of just went in a direction and thought that just because you had something to say, or you had some kind of meaningful comment, that it was flawless. You may not think it was flawless, but what you have to understand is that from the perspective of a reader, if you're going in a direction and you're not addressing the obvious counter arguments to that, well, then your reader thinks that, you know, you are just arrogantly going in one direction and don't recognize your other arguments exist. So my suggestion for you is to just make sure that you, as you present information, if the opposing arguments are clear here and evident, address them right away. For example, paper number 2, you're going to be setting up your criteria as your organizational structure. So you're not going to go and summarize one article and then summarize another article for your whole paper. You're going to say, here's criterion number 1. Here's treatment A evidence. Here's treatment B evidence. Which one wins? I'm going to go to criterion number 2. Here's treatment A evidence. Here's treatment B evidence. Which one wins? Okay, that's how we're going to focus on. So that will help you with the development of an argumentative structure. The issue of introductions, conclusions, right? I mean, many people tended to write introductions from the perspective of their argument. In other words, what an introduction should do is an introduction should establish that an argument exists, and then you give your thesis. Many people kind of just wrote the introduction from, I'm going to support prayer, I'm going to reject prayer, and that's it. And so making sure that you're, you know, setting up the fact that there's 2 different ways of looking at this, so that then when your thesis comes out, now I can say, okay, you're going to take that direction, so demonstrate that for me in the body paragraphs. If you see this comment, relate to thesis, it means that at the end of that paragraph, I have no idea what that information is doing to support your argument. Many people just ended talking about issues, but really didn't bring those issues back to demonstrate that, hey, if you think about it this way, this is why the argument is going in my direction. So those unity issues are pretty big. Comma rules. We'll talk about those comma rules in the next couple of days, but I just wanted to throw out a bunch of them here. So what we've got in some of these situations is the comma coordinated conjunction problem, right? I mean, you need to be aware that when you see a comma coordinated conjunction, there's only 2 ways you're going to see that in the English language. One is when it separates independent clauses, and the other is when it separates items in series, milk, bread, and eggs. This is items in coordination. This isn't series. There's only 2 of them. Ineffective and worthless. So that comma right there can't work, right? It's not 2 independent clauses. It's not items in series. So here's the items in series 1, right? And so when you have the items in series, what has to happen is that comma has to be here, right? I mean, a lot of people will say, well, my English teacher told me it didn't need to be there. Well, it does. Introductory phrases. whenever you have anything, whether it's a word, whether it's a phrase, whether it's a clause, dependent clause, if it's in front of your independent clause, then it needs to be separated with a comma. All right? So when you see something like this, upon seeing this, comma, right? However, comma. If the treatment doesn't work, comma, right? Anything that comes in front of your independent clause is an introductory element. And introductory elements need to be separated from the independent clauses. Okay? When you're joining together independent clauses, patients want to do what they can, that's a sentence. The patient is free to do whatever, choose something about their own life. You have an independent clause here, you have an independent clause here, you have a coordinating conjunction here, you've got to have that comma. Using however to separate independent clauses. We know that when you're joining independent clauses this way, we need a semicolon because we've got that transitional adverb, right? So whenever you have independent clause, and conjunctive adverb, semicolon needs to go in there. And then the appositive phrase. Murphy, a reporter, is not reliable. An appositive phrase is a group of words that renames the noun before it. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but essentially what you need to recognize, it's a non-essential element, right? We're just renaming who Murphy is. My independent clause is that Murphy is not reliable. So a reporter is kind of renaming who Murphy is. That gets set off with commas on both sides, okay? Well, those rules are in your book. We'll talk about them. You will often find me writing things like cliche or trite, right? For example, I must have read 50 times this word, this group of words right here. On the other hand, right? What other hand? Now, I'm not dealing with hands, right? So you laugh about that, but my point is that you are relying on conversational constructions when you write. And when you're writing, you give your reader time to scrutinize the meanings of your words. And if you're using words that aren't accurate, then you're throwing off your reader's perspective on things, right? You know, something like this, you know, using the word thing. There is one thing. I don't know what a thing is. Is it a wrench? I don't know, right? I mean, what is that thing? You know, talking about something that gets under people's skin. I mean, we're not injecting people, right? What road are we talking about that's long, right? When we see these cliches and trite phrases. So avoid all of that. You know, and I had mentioned before things like in today's society and over, and you know, and this all really goes hand in hand with diction problems. And this is what we're going to talk about today in the text. So I just want you to see where the diction problems are in your paper. And everyone's guilty of this, right? I mean, everyone had lots of yellow markings throughout their paper. What it means is that we're operating on a really conversational level. So when you see these yellow markings, right, be aware, I need to strengthen my language. I need to find accurate terms here. The there is, there are, it is, it seems combination was just populating your papers, right? I mean, that stuff has got to come out, right? We need to reconstruct our sentences so we don't have those irrelevant pronouns. Using a word like said or say, right? When you're talking, you know, some people would use phrases like, you know, that is to say, and I'm like, you're not speaking. Why would you tell me that you're saying something, right? Articles don't have the ability to speak. So obviously the word said doesn't make sense there, right? Something like this, they'll do whatever it takes. Well, what does it stand for? I don't know, right? These are words that just don't have meaning. You can't use words that don't have meaning because now you're asking your reader to interpret those things. Or this, you know, introductory phrase, in reality, and I'm like, what, as opposed to a fantasy? What, I mean, you operating in a different world than I am? Or how about this one, the true reality? It's not your reality, it's the right one, right? So now we are dealing with multiple realities. And you think to yourselves, you know, well, when I was writing this, you know, I was just kind of getting my ideas down on paper, and that's great, right? But once you get your ideas down on paper, now you've got to go back over and you've got to recognize the inherent weaknesses of some of that conversational language that you're using, right? You've got to just make yourselves aware of the fact that, hey, I'm doing this, I'm writing this, I'm just getting my ideas down, but at some point in time, you got to go back and fix it. Dealing with, no one's distributing things, right? No one's playing cards, right? The word hard, right? This is hard to see or hard to explain. Well, I'm not seeing things, right? If it's hard to see, it means that I'm blind. Hard means this, right? The desk is hard. Or someone who's going to see the doctor. What are they, traveling? right? Is going the right word there? When you say you're going to the doctor, no, you're treated, right? And your doctor's you're not traveling to the doctor's office to look at them, right? This stuff doesn't make sense. You think it does when you're writing it because you've never challenged the words that you've used in the past. This is the reason why you take this course, right? Because now we're asking you to operate on a level of diction and a level of professional language, right? It's going to be relevant to your field. Can't operate this way anymore, right? Based on, right? Okay, a couple of other things. When you see TRANS, it means transition problems, right? And whatever you are dealing with, either if the TRANS is between a paragraph or if it's between sentences, it means you need a better transition there. You're kind of abruptly moving from one idea to the other. And what that often does is it leads to coherence gaps. If you see awkward phrasing, it means that you've got a bunch of words in here and it's just bumbling around trying to get to something specific. Stop for a second and think to yourself, what can I do to spit this out in a clearer, more concise way, right? So the AWK is kind of a general phrase we use for, those really, unclear, but not necessarily inaccurate. I mean, I know that you're trying to say something there, but the words that you're using are just not coming out clear. If you see WC, it means word choice. Whenever you have something in green, right, that's a word choice problem. It means that, a lot of times people did this with patients, right? You said the patients that did something. They're people, right? So it's patients who do something. They're not things, right? We don't want to treat them as things. But, or if you misuse a word, right? And some people have just, misspelled words or just used the wrong words in their papers, right? In sentences like this, pills can be destructible. Well, if you hit them with a hammer, yeah, they probably blow apart, right? That means they're destructible. You mean destructive? Yeah, probably, right? Words have meaning. You better know what words you're using and the meanings of those words, or don't write them, or look them up. All right. When you see things like this, weak and meaningless verbs, we're going to talk about this when we talk about the verb-based writing strategies, but a lot of those diction problems that we talked about, right, all stem from the fact that we're using these kinds of verbs right here. Verbs like make, put, do, go, see, look, come, have as a main verb, right? These are the culprits that make for weak sentences. These are the words that many people use in conversational vocabularies, right? When you get comfortable using these words, you can use them all you want when you speak, but when you write, they lead to inaccuracies. So that group of words, I'd make a list of these things, I'd put them on your bathroom mirror, I'd take them to your notebook, I'd take you to the side of your computer so when you're typing, right, you can use it on your first draft, on your second draft, but before you turn that paper in, edit those things out. Find more accurate, meaningful verbs. We'll deal with that later. Something like, Benson or Jones conducted a study, right? And I'm sitting there saying, oh yeah, conducted's a good verb, but all research scientists conduct studies, right? So to tell me that someone's conducting a study is to like tell me that the sky is blue, right? Benson conducted a study on intercessory prayer. That's not a meaningful sentence, right? What you want to say is that Benson's study on intercessory prayer did something. See the difference? Yeah, we're not trying to just state the obvious. And I know that a lot of you are just, you're in, what you should consider that first paper you wrote as simply an early draft, right? Because what you did was you kind of let some things slide by. You didn't think clearly about what you were writing. But you will as time goes on. Next paper you write, you'll be more careful. Paper after that, you'll be even more careful. The more we learn, the more we practice, the better we're going to get at this. Agreement problems, right? Between the pronoun and noun, I always mark this one in blue, right? If it's a patient, then it's got to be his or her. You should know that. We talked about that in class. If you see the word they, right? They, a lot of times I wrote it with words like thing, right? Something, this is the thing that, starting a sentence, with a pronoun that doesn't have, clear antecedent, right? Starting a sentence with this or it, right? If it doesn't have a clear noun to relate to, problem. I also used words like unclear or clarify or define, right? When you see that, that's your problem. It's highlighted in yellow, and I wrote vague, unclear, clarify, or define. You're starting out with words that don't have clear meanings. Coherence problems. If I had to write on your paper, I use this little telephone pole to mark the coherence problem, but most of the time I just wrote coherence gap. Right? A coherence gap is a serious problem. It means that the sentence you wrote before the gap and the sentence you wrote after the gap have absolutely no connection to each other from an objective reader's perspective. Right? So if you're writing and you've got coherence gaps, it means you do not maintain a train of thought across that paragraph. It means you're just kind of throwing out here's an idea, here's an idea, here's an idea, you figure it out. Right? It's not my job to put together puzzles. It's not my job to figure things out. It's my job to be entertained. Right? You show me your train of thought, you argue out your position. So coherence problems, they're big. We'll deal with passive and active in another couple of days. So I just don't worry about that one right now. Stay in present tense when you're talking about research, right? Instead of saying Murphy claimed that, you want to be able to say Murphy claims, right? Whenever you're talking about research, you're talking about it in this continual present. You can pick that research up 100 years from now, and it's going to say the same thing, right? So whenever we talk about research, we use present tense. Dangling modifiers, right? You got an ing word that's in that introductory phrase. That word's acting as an adjective. Who's doing the practicing? This sentence says precaution is practicing medicine. That's a problem, right? Dangling modifiers, highlighted in blue. I usually label it as DM, right after the blue mark. If you see PRED, it means a predication problem. It means that you can't, this doesn't make sense. We say it all the time, but it doesn't translate. Is when, is why, is where, is because. That doesn't exist in the English language. We say it all the time. It's usually because we start out with the reason for, and then we say is because of this, right? Way too bumbling of a sentence, awkward, confusing, using verb predication here that doesn't necessarily exist in the English language, right? Is being used as a helping verb, but you don't have a verb to follow. Right? It's not a state of being either. So we need to throw that sentence out. Instead of saying the reason for thinking this is because they, you could just say they think this because they are accurate or wrong or whatever. Way too many words, way too much dependence on conversational thinking, right? Get yourselves out of that conversational mode and into a clear, accurate, precise mode. Spelling, I can't even tell you why, how to approach that, except that pay attention to your spell check. Look it up if you don't know how to spell it, especially my name, right? It's embarrassing when you misspell the instructor's name on a paper. If I'm writing things like proofread or words missing, right? I mean, you're juniors in college, right? You shouldn't be writing sentences where words are missing from your sentences. I should be able to read a sentence and it should be able to make sense from you. Right? That's kind of shocking. The major grammatical errors, right? There's plenty of them, right? Look, I don't need to go through the process here of spelling out all the major grammatical errors, but you guys, you held firm on the statistics, right? I mean, I told you 75% of you would commit one, 50% would commit two, and it was really close. It was right on the mark, right? We went over it. At this point, you got to learn it. And if you don't learn it, you're going to have a heck of a time later when the assignments get much more complicated and your time is just going to get sucked up by doing all the research. You're not going to have time to be really focusing on trying to do these kind of elementary things. This needs to be internalized so that when you're putting those sentences together the first time through, you can catch these things and get it out of your way. You don't want to be scrambling around trying to worry about these things, because when you get into that longer research paper at the end of the semester, you're going to have so much going on in that paper. Just trying to get it done is going to be, a task. And then when you're under that type of pressure, you let those kind of things like grammar slide, and then you make a bunch of those mistakes, and guess what? Here we are at the end of the semester, you got a paper that's full of grammatical errors, right? You end up getting a bad grade on it, and it just kills you. So let's get those grammar issues under control. If you see choppy SS, that means choppy sentence structure. It means, your sentences need more variety. That was a really limited problem. I mean, it's just a few people that did that, but most of the time people did pretty well. If you're going to ask questions in class or in the paper, right? I told you, don't ask questions, but taking the question mark out from the end of the sentence doesn't make it any better, right? If it's still written as a question, right? You can't just take the question mark out, right? You got to turn it into a statement. The most important thing that I have to say is this one right here. Just make sure everything's related to your thesis, right? And what I found to be problematic the most was the reasoning issues, right? Failure to see the whole picture, the whole argument, okay? So these are the kind of things that I wrote about. I mean, I constantly asked questions. I constantly was challenging what you were arguing, right? Don't take offense to the fact that I was, arguing against you. And I know that my comments might come across as being, really cutting or maybe, almost smart aleck in a way, like, well, what do you think about this, right? I mean, if I'm doing that, it's only because I'm just applying the logical perspective to this, right? I'm not trying to attack you. I'm not trying to make you feel stupid, right? I'm just trying to show you the weaknesses in what you're writing. So all you need to be is, aware and start preparing for those kind of things. All right. So in chapter 3, and you don't have to open your book, but if you have it with you, I'm on page 73, 74. There's this whole section in here about word choice and diction in the text. And this is really something that I want to talk about in relationship to paper 1, because what we're going to do is really try to eliminate wordiness, right? Making sure that our language communicates the right message, the accurate terms. We have a problem, right? And our problem is that we don't see things on, we've gotten ourselves into a habit of writing in a way that we speak, and we know that there's other ways of writing things, but we just don't employ them. And so now it's just a matter of changing our habits. But essentially what we do, right, when the reason why all this stuff comes out is that there's different parts of your brain. I'll explain a lot of cognitive science, and Dr. Diction she's probably a lot better at this than I am because she's our cognition specialist here on campus. But essentially what we've determined over time is that our brains operate by compiling information, taking the information from whatever we know, and then we have to process that information in order to communicate it, in order to write it out. Well, it's that central processing system. It's taking the information from the hemispheres of our brain and putting it through that processor before we spit it out, either verbally or in writing. It's that central processor where a lot of these problems take place. And what happens in that part of the brain is that we tend to fill it with kind of ready reference words. In other words, we fill that brain, we practice writing and speaking in certain ways so that we only have at our ready a few words and terms, like that list of words I gave you, make and go and see and put, right? Those are the words that are kind of operating in your ready reference library, which we call that central processor. What we need to be able to do is we need to recognize that we need to build stronger terms. We need to visualize action. We need to see things differently and start filling that ready reference with stronger language so that when we access our brains for information, we're accessing more powerful, more meaningful terms, right? I mean, it's very easy to determine, how fast someone's, hamster is running on the wheel, right, by the language that they use, right? And this is the reason why you ever see those college, admissions essays, right? They ask you to write, something, why do you want to be a physical therapist or something like that, right? The answer to the question is not what we're looking at, right? We're looking at how you're using language. We're looking at what you are using for terms, right? How you're using language to describe things to determine whether you have some experience with your field, right? If you have experience, if you know what you're talking about, your brain is going to be processing stronger pieces of information, stronger language in there that's going to relate to your profession. So we're using those kind of things, not because we care what the answer to the question is. Well, maybe somebody does, I don't know. But when I look at that stuff, I'm looking at, what kind of intellectual ability does this person have? Right? How much experience with the profession do they have? And if they're using, really elementary level language, well, they have a really elementary level understanding of the profession. So this exercise today, what we're trying to get to, is really this point right here. The fuzzy writing comes from fuzzy thinking. Right? If you're not sure what you're trying to say, you're going to be using inaccurate language. So how do we fix that? Well, you want to just make sure that you're looking at your writing from the perspective of the reader, right? Easy reading comes from hard writing. If you're putting forth the effort to put the accurate words down on paper, then my job as a reader is simply to just sit back and be entertained, right? I use the image all the time of, putting your reader on a set of tracks, or just pushing your reader down the line to get to that, to that point that you're trying to make. Organization, coherence, and all those things help with that too. But the language that you use is more specific to getting your reader to the task, right? You want to be able to be specific in what you're trying to do so that your reader understands it, right? I also tell people all the time, right? It's my job to kind of just get on the bus, right? You're driving the bus and you're taking us to where we need to go, right? As a reader, right, I don't want to be driving the bus, right? It's not my job to drive the bus. Your job is to drive the bus. My job is to kind of sit on the bus, look out the window, and be entertained, right? And from some writing that I'm getting, I'm not even on the bus, right? I'm tied to the back of the bus getting dragged, right? Because I have no idea what you're talking about, right? And when I'm back there trying to run to keep up with the bus to figure out what you're saying, right, that's work. As a reader, I can't do that work because I don't know what you're trying to do. I can't just figure out your thought processes. So think about your writing from the perspective of a reader. That's why I ask you, have other people read your papers, right? Because if someone else is reading your paper and they don't know what you're talking about, well, take their word for it, right? You got a problem. All right, so some of the things that I've written in here, which I think are going to be relevant to the conversation that is going to apply to paper 2, is this little thing down here, right? Here's how we need to think of language. Way over here on this side of the spectrum is the less professional language, right? Here's slang, and as you can see, right, I mean, no one is writing in slang. And then we go more toward the conversational, which is no one's writing exactly how they speak, right? So, I mean, if we were, then we would just be transcribing. No, you're more organized, you're more thoughtful. Even though you're using language that's not real strong, you're over here on this end of the spectrum using kind of that popular language, or maybe it's a little stronger, which I'll call common language, right? If you're using kind of the popular form of writing, you're operating at a 9th grade reading level, right? When you pick up news magazines and that kind of stuff that you know from the newsstands and that kind of stuff, they're written for a 9th grade reading audience. Because most people in this country, that's what they have, intellectually speaking, right? It's about a 9th grade level of comprehension. You're operating a little bit stronger than that with this common form right now, right? Where you're using a little bit stronger language, you're dealing with a little bit higher intellectual plane, but you're still using language that's infiltrated here from the conversational, right? I need you to get over here, right, to the formal, which is every word on the paper makes sense. Every word, every mark, every piece of information that comes out of that is directed toward the thesis, is purposeful, right? If it's not, then you're not doing your job. You're back down here. So be aware of the fact that, you know, there's strategies to do this. Well, I mean, some of the things that I'm going to see from this paper, right, are words like this, right, where you're going to see people, instead of using an appropriate term like facilitate, will gravitate towards something like make easy, right? Where the word make, ding, 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 that's part of our list, right? It's one of those weak verbs. We don't want to be using that, right? Someone who runs fast should be sprinting, right? If someone has, you know, something to, you know, to give away, right, then they may be presenting it. This is the strategy that I need you to be incorporating. You know, and I'm going to, you know, mark these things up here, right? When people will say, you know, many people wrote in this paper that prayer has beneficial results, or the people in those studies showed significant changes. What is a beneficial result? If you don't define what beneficial is, how am I supposed to know what that means? Right? And then people wrote that, well, you know, we're trying to figure out if prayer works. And I'm highlighting the word works, and I'm like, what does that mean? I don't know what works mean. Does it mean that it heals? Does it make me fly? I don't know, right? If works isn't defined, then what's your reader supposed to do with that information? Right? This is the accuracy, the clarity issue that we're constantly struggling with at the professional level, because once you get into documentation, you start writing this stuff for the scrutiny of your bosses and your scrutiny of insurance companies, and you're using language that doesn't have meaning, guess what they're going to do, right? They're going to reject your claim. They're going to, you know, fire you from your job. They're not going to want that. We need you to be able to write in a way that everybody who reads it knows what you're talking about. I swiped this from one of the PT journals, which or a PT textbook one day. I thought this was really interesting. They have this whole section here called common terms versus functional phrase alternatives. And when I say common terms, right, we're on that end of the spectrum where we're close to the formal, but what we're really looking for is the functional alternative, right? We want the language that has function, not the language that is common. For example, right, if someone is confused, right, they could have dementia, right? They could be, overwhelmed at that point in time. They could have an attention span deficit because of confusion in the room, or maybe they've got a condition that leads to attention deficit. My point is that the word confused can have multiple meanings, right? You've got to provide the right definition. Yeah.
Is this on Blackboard?
Yeah, I put it on the Blackboard page too. Yeah. And the same thing happens here, right? If you're going to tell me that a patient has improved, right? If you don't define what improved means, then that is absolutely worthless information. Because as the functional phrase alternatives, say here, they're looking at, look, if you're going to tell me they're improving, we need to see comparative data, right? We need to see what they're presently doing versus what they previously did. So to use these words like significant changes, beneficial results, or improved, that common language, it's not professional, it's not scientific. I love this one down here, right, where someone says, like especially, I observed the patient or I monitored the patient, and you think to yourself, wow, those are really good action verbs. No, they're not, right? Because if you're just standing there observing and monitoring the patient, you're not doing anything with the information that you're getting, right? Obviously, when you're working with a patient, you're evaluating that patient. In other words, you're recording what kind of actions are taking place so that you can report that there's changes occurring. You're analyzing that patient's behavior, whether it be physical, emotional, or whatever, right? You're analyzing that in order to make some determinations out of it. These are words that are polysyllabic and sound pretty action-oriented, but they're not really useful for what you're going to be doing in your job. So be aware of the fact that you may think it has meaning, right? But we're looking to operate on this side. You've got to provide function. You can't just throw out vague, meaningless language. So this whole thing is this chart is on Blackboard. This chapter 3, I think, is get you started going in that direction. Don't worry about the verb-based writing strategies and stuff that I keep talking about. We'll get to those in a few weeks, but I certainly just want you to start scrutinizing the language so that you avoid that constant yellow mark of using common terms. All right? Over here on 76 and 77 is a section on word choice. And I want to just alert you to this because I saw lots of people kind of misusing words. And the ones that I saw being misused the most were affect and effect on 77 and utilize and use over here on 76. What's going to happen when people start thinking, oh, I need to use bigger words, right? That's what Terry Berry's saying. I'm not saying use bigger words. I'm saying use the right word, right? And this is how people get into confusing situations where they think that by using a polysyllabic word, when I say you have more than one syllable, right? When you use a polysyllabic word, it doesn't make you sound smarter if you don't use it effectively, right? And utilize and use, you got to get this straight, right? If you use something, you use it for its intended purpose. This is a pen, right? Its intended purpose is to write. I'm using it to write, not utilizing it to write, because to utilize it would mean I use it for its unintended purpose, right? So if I were to stab you with my pen, right, I would be utilizing it as a weapon, right? You understand the difference, right? I'm now not using it for its intended purpose. So if you're utilizing prayer to heal people, as many of you wrote this last time, right, you're telling me that you're using prayer for its unintended purpose. And I'm saying that's prayer's intended purpose. It's intended to heal people. You're telling me that it's not its intention. So understand the difference between utilize and use. Affect and effect, look, I mean, there's noun and verb forms of both of these. The ones that you are probably using the most are effect, no, an effect as an outcome. This is one you probably use the most, and to influence, affect as a verb. So these are the ones that you're probably, so you're talking about the results of a study, you're talking about the effect of what occurred in the equation, right? If you're talking about, this drug affected people, well then the affect verb form means to influence. I would just suggest that whenever you see the word affect used as a verb, just substitute the word influence in there. If influence works, then use influence, right? But there are also noun and verb forms. For example, there is an affect, right? People's affect tells us a lot about their condition. So their behavior, their outward appearance. So they have an inappropriate affect, right? If you laugh when someone dies or something like that, that's an inappropriate affect. And you also have the verb effect, right? Which is to bring about. In other words, a drug can effect changes. A drug can bring about. So whenever you see effect used as a verb, you got to do the test, right? Put to bring about in there or put influence in there and see which one makes sense, right? If it's to bring about, then it's effect. If it's to influence, it's affect. Okay, so those are some really, important issues that you're going to just have to practice using and developing, right? And this is a skill, right? You all know that what I'm telling you is really all about developing skills. It's about developing a muscle memory, right? If I'm going to learn how to play darts, if I want to be good at darts, I'm going to stand here, I'm going to practice throwing darts at that target over and over again. So eventually my muscles start to memorize exactly what motions I need to hit the bullseye, right? That's what we do. Same thing here, right? If you practice doing things the right way, if you practice using language that's meaningful, then you start to develop those skills. Those words start to stick in your brain, and you start to use that language on a regular basis, and then eventually you start sounding like a professional. You start writing like a professional, right? But when your mother's told you, garbage in, garbage out, if you hang around with stupid people, you're probably going to be stupid, right? She was probably right. Because when you surround yourself with stupid people, then those stupid things start to look like the right things, right? We don't want to do that. We don't want to make bad decisions. We want to make good decisions. We want to surround ourselves. We want to practice doing things using language the right way so that when it comes time to present our ideas, it comes across as being meaningful, right? All right. So that's my spiel about diction. We'll obviously have to learn this and work with this more as time goes on. But essentially, what I wanted to do for the rest of class today was to talk to you, briefly about the paper 2 and kind of the organizational principles and those kind of things. And one thing I thought was really helpful for students last year is when I kind of put this up, right? And I told my students, I said, all right, look. What you need to do is you need to establish a matrix. And at the top of the page, you should just put the criteria that you have for your operational definition. In other words, what you're trying to accomplish. If you have a treatment or if you have a condition and you know that you're trying to accomplish something with treatments, those things should go at the top of the page, right? And that's your operational definition. However you're defining those things, that's going to come out in the specifics later on. But then what you can do is you can go look at your studies, right? You can take the Jones et al. Study, you can take the Smith study, and then you can start to present the data, like just box it up. Start to say, okay, what did Jones say about pain? What kind of results did he get? What kind of evidence did he have? How reliable is that evidence? So that then you can put the results from Smith right next to it, and you can kind of, with the summaries, look at those two and say, all right, now I can write about this, right? So this becomes paragraph number 1. Pain, here's Jones, here's Smith, here's what they mean, right? And again, don't get into a habit of just listing out a whole bunch of information about Jones and then taping in a paragraph about Smith and then coming to some kind of conclusion. It's your job to synthesize this information, right? So when I say synthesize, summarize it down, get it into this little compartment, and then write about it logically, right? You say, okay, Jones did this and Smith did this, and here's what Jones found, here's what Smith found. If you compare these things, you obviously see Smith's better. That's what I need you to do, right? So even within these paragraphs, like if you got a paragraph about pain, I don't want to see a whole big paragraph about Jones and a whole big paragraph about Smith, and then a one-sentence conclusion saying, oh, Smith's better, right? You need to synthesize this information, put them into the box, figure it out, and then write about it. And do it with all the other categories as well. And as you can see, maybe there's some categories that are going to be stronger in terms of your operational definition than others, right? So you may find that, okay, I need to pay closer and special attention to range of motion because, as we talked about last time, when we were dealing with the knee osteoarthritis, maybe range of motion was a more reliable measure of success. So if the evidence is stronger here for Smith than it is for Jones in range of motion, maybe that helps. Maybe Smith's good in these categories up here, but Jones is better in this category. So maybe you're looking at it and saying, yeah, maybe Smith's got the right, the better evidence here. If you put it in this matrix, it helps you kind of visualize the argument, the comparison, right? And it'll also help you synthesize this information down. I know that a lot of people don't like to do more work than they have to, right? You're trying to find shortcuts, you're trying to find the easiest way to accomplish the task. There is no easy way, it's time consuming. Get used to it, right? Eat, sleep, do schoolwork, right? You can sleep when Christmas break comes, right? So do these kind of things, right? Start figuring out how to manage information so that it'll make your life easier. So some of the things that I'm finding kind of interesting, and maybe you've seen this kind of stuff, right? I'm looking at a lot of people's papers and the types of responses. And I found somebody was writing about carpal tunnel syndrome, and she brought this chart in, and she's really confused. She's like, I just don't understand what's going on in this chart. And so we kind of sat down, and I thought it was probably important that we talk about it because it's a pretty good representation of the kind of things that you should be looking for, right? All right, so what we've got here is pain, right? From, this is, what did I say? What, carpal tunnel, what's the ultrasound, right? All right, so it's ultrasound at certain wavelengths. So they measured pain before treatment and after treatment, and they give a p-value. So what they're saying here, right, is that before treatment they were in a 6 with a plus or minus 2, and they went to about a 3 with a plus or minus 1, right? So what they're saying is that the p-value here shows significance, that they moved as a group down the scale. So they had pain, it started at a 6 and went to a 2. That p-value is over there. So now look at this. So here's this next group. They went from a 7 to a 3. They went from a 7 to a 4. And each one of these things was significant. And what's interesting, though, is this one, right? That over here is the comparison between the groups, right? So they're saying that between groups A, B, and C, there really was no difference. They all pretty much moved the same amount on the scale. So if you pay attention to what the statistics are helping you understand, right? This one is saying the movement occurred here, the movement occurred here, the movement occurred here. This is all due to treatment. But this is saying that the movement, no matter what the wavelength was, didn't matter. It all got pretty much the same results. And so then that's why you need to look down the scale, right? And you can see here in all these situations that between the group, nothing was different between the groups. That's what that p-value is doing over there. And this is kind of, this cross-sectional analysis that we're looking at here, this is a pretty good way for you to be looking at your data, right? A lot of times you're going to see p-values and you're going to see stats that are applied only to certain categories of your research, right? And they're not going to be really applying the stats to something like the between group part. If you're arguing about which one is better here, this type of ultrasound or this type of ultrasound, the argument is that there's no difference. So I thought this was a pretty good way of evaluating it. If you take a look at down here, So those were all pain and night pain and frequency of awakening things, which I think are probably really pretty subjective measures, right? We'll look at carpal tunnel now when you start doing the more quantitative measures. Uh-oh. P-values are all greater than 0.05. So when we start measuring latency, right? We start making like nerve conduction studies. We start, seeing what actually happens physiologically with that. The ultrasound didn't get any results. Matter of fact, some people got worse. So here's a really interesting perspective, right? In the qualitative end of things, the patients got better. In the quantitative, they didn't. Does that mean the treatment doesn't work? I don't know. If you think about it from the perspective that you guys were arguing a lot with that intercessory prayer paper, this is kind of interesting, right? A lot of you argued that if it works for a patient, then why not do it? So if the patient's reporting less pain, this is an article that demonstrates, hey, the patients like what they're getting. The patients are reporting less pain. But all of you were, a lot of other people in this class were saying, look, if there's no physical change, then we shouldn't be doing it because that's not medicine. If we're just dealing with perceptions of things. So here's something that shows we're not getting physical change, but we're getting that psychological change, maybe? This is the prayer argument, isn't it? This is it. This is what we're talking about. People responding qualitatively, but the quantitative measures don't hold up for the treatment. So we throw ultrasound out as a treatment? I don't know. If a patient's responding to it, I mean, if you're an insurance company, think about this. If you're an insurance company, you're paying people to do this, right? You're going to have a pretty tough time writing that check, aren't you? Because where's the justifiable evidence that the treatment is doing something physiologic? It's not there. I made the argument a lot of times, right, with the prayer arguments, right, when people were arguing for prayer, because if it gets the patient to think that they're getting better, if they just like the way they feel about it or something, then yes, we should support it. And I'm saying, well, how could you justify that? Because can't we get that type of support, that emotional support, or that kind of psychological change from something other than prayer? Can't we just tell you to think better thoughts? Can I get that result? I mean, what might have been a result? What might have caused this? I mean, look at the p-values, right? The p-values say that the treatment caused the outcome. You familiar with ultrasound? You know what ultrasound does? Anybody ever have ultrasound? They put that warm goo on you, right? And they rub around that thing and shoots the wavelength, sound waves or something in there. Could these results be simply response to the warm goo that you're putting on there? Depends on when the after treatment was evaluated, right? Was it immediately after treatment? They seem to think, well, hey, look, at night, we got better results. I don't know how good those results are when you look at these standard deviations. But there could be things going on in here that are related to the treatment, where the treatment is actually showing up in the stats as being successful, but it might not be the ultrasound that's causing the change. Maybe it's just the fact that someone's being treated. Maybe that's what's causing the change. Psychological change? I don't know. So this is the kind of stuff you need to be aware of. right? I mean, what does it say? I mean, and when it says something like that, what does it mean? What do we do in that situation? How do we respond to that? Right? I mean, when you see no physiological change, but you see this kind of, qualitative changes, what's more important? That's what you need to figure out, right? That's why you have that operational definition. That's why I'm asking you to kind of think about that. What was it, carpal tunnel? Right. You deal with carpal tunnel patients, are they really thinking about nerve firing? Are they worried about that delay in their nerves? Or are they worried about pain? If all we're trying to do is reduce their pain, well, we got over-the-counter medications, get prescription medications that can deal with pain. I would think that the physical changes have to be priority when you're dealing with something like carpal tunnel. Right? And if they're getting the qualitative, but they're not getting the quantitative, well, I don't know how good the treatment is. But that's just my perspective. That's why you need to figure it out. All right. Any questions about anything that I've talked about here today? I mean, anything that you're seeing in your research? I mean, I'm open to having conversations with you about that research. If you want to just kind of adjourn for the day, and then we can come back to some of the stuff on Monday. I just want to make sure I look ahead and find out when this paper is due, right? Because it's coming up pretty fast, right? The 30th. What's today? 23rd. Yeah. So the draft is due on Wednesday. We'll do on Monday the rules of comma usage, punctuation rules, and those kind of things from the textbook, which would be pretty fun. All right, any other questions? I'll adjourn now. If any of you want to ask questions, stick around about your articles or something like that, we'll certainly take those questions. All right, thanks, folks. Have a good weekend.